Good morning. This is Dina Marie Hale, host of Faith Moments and the voice of the shepherd with a morning blend interview on Mater Dei Radio. August 11th is the feast day of Saint Clare, co-foundress of the Order of the Poor Ladies or the Poor Clares, and the first abbess of Saint Damiano. She was born in Assisi and was inspired by the life of Saint Francis of Assisi. But who was Saint Clare and what was her relationship with Saint Francis? And what can her life say about our lives and our life with Christ? Well, today to share some Franciscan moments about St. Clare is Father Dan Pattee. He's been joining us to share with us some insights upon our Catholic faith. Good morning, Father Dan. Thanks for coming back on the program.
Hey, good morning, Dina Marie. Good to be with you again.
Well, actually, my confirmation name is Saint Clare, and I
Oh,
knew nothing
wonderful.
about Saint Clare, but there was a beautiful young daughter of the family who sponsored me into the church, and their daughter's name was Claire, and I really got drawn to that name. So I'm really excited to hear a little bit about who was Saint Clare and who is she today in the church. Take us back to her life in the early 1100s, almost 1200.
Yeah, she was born in 1194,
Okay.
in July of 1194. So, but she lived a rather long life in terms of someone in medieval terms, even though a lot of her health, she had some terrible health problems. She died in 1950 or 1253. And she was initially what we would call a penitent, living in her home and giving food to the poor. That was the order of penance at the time that was all over Italy. And that's how she started her care for the poor, even though she was a very noble woman, which meant that she came from money. Her father had a lot of money. Affreduccio was the last name. They belonged to the nobility of Assisi, and so they were plugged in. They were living in a castle, nice home, and out the back door of that castle, she was trying to feed the poor as a penitent
Right. When did
initially.
she come across Saint Francis and start hearing about this young man and his crazy life?
Yeah, well, so the Poor Clares actually go back to around 1212. So it was sometime between 1210 and 1212. We don't know the exact date because Francis went to Rome and, of course, started the first order of the Friars in 1209 to 1210. And then Clare comes on the scene in 1212. Well, somewhere in there, Francis was preaching at the Cathedral of San Giorgio. It's a church in Assisi. And Clare heard him and she went to him and asked him, could you help me live the gospel?
Hmm.
And so what that precipitated was on Palm Sunday, Clare, in that year, it was 1212, she left her home and went to the Portiuncula, which was a small little church at that time that Francis had at the base of Mount Sabazio, just outside of town. She went to Francis to begin to live her life under his care and direction. And Francis cut her hair, which was kind of that, to cut your hair as a noblewoman, and then dressed her in the religious garb and entrusted her to the local Benedictine community at that time, where she and her sister, Caterina, also joined her. And obviously their father didn't like it. So he sent soldiers to go retrieve them at the Benedictine sisters, the Benedictine nuns convent. And they got their hands on Agnes, as she was later called Caterina. They got their hands on her and they tried to lift her, and Clare was praying, and all of a sudden she became so heavy they couldn't lift her at all. And there's nothing they could do. She was like a lead balloon.
Wow.
And so they finally just left out of exasperation and left them there to have their own way. And that was the beginning. I mean, it began with the help of the Lord, of course, instead of having the father who came and really was upset. He said, you can't do this. This is ridiculous. This Francis is a nut. By that time, people in the Assisi thought Francis was crazy,
Mhm.
you know.
Mhm. How did her life with the Poor Clares start to develop? What do we know about kind of the growing of this community of women and what their purpose was going to be?
Well, when it really started to grow is when Francis was able to secure for them a place to grow, which was San Damiano Church. And that was the first church that Francis uh, rebuilt with his own hands. As you might recall, it was there that the San Damiano crucifix, which is a very significant crucifix to the Franciscans, it was hanging in San Damiano, and it spoke to Francis, said, Francis, go rebuild my church, which as you see is falling into ruins. Well, San Damiano was falling in ruins. He built it. Well, the Bishop of Assisi permitted Francis to relocate Clare and the sisters at San Damiano, which was just outside the walls of Assisi at that time. And they became, at that time, they became known as the Poor Ladies of San Damiano. They didn't get the name Poor Clares until after Clare's death in 1253. But at that time, they were called the Poor Ladies of San Damiano. And that's when she began to accept people that, women that wanted to come to her, and they were cloistered that time. The church wouldn't permit women religious communities to be active in apostolates. They had to be cloistered. That's the only way at that time, at least, religious communities of sisters could exist, largely for safety reasons. So that's where it began to grow, and she developed and began to take sisters and form them, and they joined her at that point.
And do we know a bit about the relationship between Francis and Clare, like how she would learn, or was there instruction in terms of continuing to grow in her faith and knowledge of maybe theology, or just how did they work together to continue the order and the mission?
Well, Francis, in some ways, Clare got to know Francis so well in the early days because he took personal care of them initially, but then he began obviously to travel. He was traveling a lot, preaching, doing preaching bands, all that. And so he did always entrust particular friars to go over and take care of the poor ladies, as he would call them. But Clare got to know Francis so well and got to know his soul so well that she probably even understood Francis better than Francis did. I mean, she really got him. And in fact, Francis died in 1226. Clare, she became, in a way, the guardian of the charism of Francis after Francis's death, because she understood it so well. Even though she was behind the walls, the brothers used to learn from Clare then because she knew Francis so well, and so she got him very well in the beginning, from her association with Francis. And he would come and visit her, of course. But again, he traveled a lot. He wasn't always just kind of sitting around Assisi, to teetotal with Clare,
Right, right. Today, if we're looking at St. Clare's life, what would be one of the key lessons and things that we could maybe take on in terms of our own spirituality that we could learn from the example of St. Clare?
Well, yesterday, you might recall the first reading from Solomon's meditation upon his wealth and the like. Vanity of vanities, and
Mhm.
all is vanity. I think we could learn that from Clare, certainly, because, the wealth is something. Our relationship to created goods is going to end with death. But what's going to be the permanent relationship that will perdure and endure death? Well, it's going to be our relationship to Jesus and the Blessed Mother and the saints. And that's what Clare really held on to. She also held out for the privilege of poverty, for the Sisters of San Damiano. And I'm talking, she held out against the popes of her time, Pope Gregory the Ninth, Honorius the Third. And it wasn't until 2 days before her death on August 9th, 1953, that Honorius the Fourth finally granted Clare approval of her rule, in which there was this privilege of poverty. So, and what that meant was, religious life for women, you had to come with a dowry to enter the religious life, so that you had money to support yourself in the monastery with the sisters. Well, Clare said, like the gospel and Francis taught us, no, you take that dowry, you give all that to the poor, and then come and live here. And the Pope is looking at that and saying, well, what are you going to live on? How are you going to live? I mean, it's like, and Clare held out, and her rule provided for strict poverty and detachment from this world's goods. And she finally, just 2 days before she died, got it approved by Pope Honorius IV. So that's really incredible, I think, because she got that sense of detachment, you know.
Right. We're talking with Franciscan Friar, Father Dan Pattee, about the life of St. Clare. Father, I've got some more questions for you, particularly in August. We've got some very special feast days that I think people don't know about. Will you hold on, and we'll get into some more Franciscan moments after our break?
Sure thing.